The courtroom smelled like old paper and cold coffee. Daniel Reyes sat with his hands folded on the table, his knuckles rough and cracked from 30 years of sawdust and stain. Across the aisle, his wife Melissa laughed at something her boyfriend Ryan whispered in her ear. She didn't even lower her voice. "This is pathetic," she said, loud enough for the bailiff to glance over. "A letter? Seriously?" Daniel's lawyer had asked for a short recess so the judge could read something Daniel submitted the night before. 9 handwritten pages, folded twice, sealed in an envelope, with Ellie's name written faintly in the corner, like a reminder of who all of this was actually for. The judge slid her glasses up her nose and opened the envelope. Melissa smirked at Daniel. Ryan didn't even bother hiding his grin. Then the judge began to read the first line out loud, and the room went quiet. "Your Honor, before you decide who my daughter should live with, I need you to know who my wife really is." Melissa's smile did not move yet, but her eyes did. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Hype up the video. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started. 10 years before that courtroom, Daniel Reyes was standing in a rented garage in the back of a hardware store parking lot, sanding a chair leg by hand because he couldn't afford a lathe yet. He built Reyes & Co. Woodworks from nothing. Not from a loan his father co-signed, not from savings his family handed him. He taught himself dovetails from diagrams in books that were older than he was. He turned down easier, faster jobs because he'd already given his word to someone else. And in Daniel's world, a word was worth more than a paycheck. People who knew Daniel described him the same way, almost every time: quiet, steady, the kind of man who fixed your fence without being asked and never brought it up again. He wasn't perfect. He avoided conflict the way some people avoid heights, not out of weakness, but because he'd grown up in a house where yelling solved nothing, and silence at least kept the peace. His father had died when Daniel was 22, and in the years after, Daniel had absorbed a quiet rule for himself: take care of the people who took care of you, and don't complain about the cost. That rule nearly killed him once. 2 years into building the shop, Daniel skipped his own health checkups, not because he didn't care about his body, but because every dollar that could go to a doctor's visit went to keeping the lights on in the shop instead. He worked through a torn shoulder for 4 months because a client needed a custom staircase finished before winter. When he met Melissa, she was the first person outside his family who made him feel like it was okay to want something for himself. She laughed at his terrible jokes. She sat in the garage with him some nights, drinking coffee out of chipped mugs, listening to him talk about grain patterns and finish coats like they were poetry. For a long time, it felt like partnership. Real partnership. So when the shop finally turned a real profit in year 6, Daniel didn't think twice about adding Melissa as co-owner. "We're a team," he told her, signing the paperwork at the kitchen table with Ellie asleep upstairs. "Everything I build is supposed to be ours." Melissa kissed his forehead and told him that was the sweetest thing anyone had ever done for her. It would be years before Daniel understood what that kiss actually was. 6 months before the divorce hearing, Melissa came to him with a folder of documents. "Restructuring paperwork," she called it. "For taxes, my accountant says it'll save us thousands if we file the ownership differently before year-end." Daniel was elbow-deep in a client order that week, a set of dining chairs that were already 2 weeks behind schedule. He skimmed the papers at the kitchen counter, saw Melissa's name next to his in a few places he expected. He had no reason not to. The letter he wrote the night before the hearing pauses here, briefly, almost like Daniel himself doesn't want to dwell on it yet. "I want to tell you about my mother first," he wrote, "because if you understand her, you'll understand why any of this matters at all." The judge looked up from the page for a moment, glancing at Melissa. Melissa's arms were crossed now. Her laugh from earlier was gone. "Continue," she told the bailiff, and went back to reading. Grace Reyes moved in with Daniel and Melissa 4 years after Daniel's father died of a stroke in the driveway of the house he'd owned. She said it a dozen times in the weeks before. "I don't want to be a burden, mijo." But the house was too big for her alone, and her hip had started giving her trouble on the stairs, and Daniel wasn't going to let his mother live alone at 63, with nobody to check on her. "It's temporary," Grace told her sister on the phone the week she packed her boxes. "Just until I'm back on my feet." 4 years later, she was still saying it was temporary. Grace never asked for anything. She cooked dinner most nights, not because anyone asked her to, but because she picked Ellie up from school twice a week. She sewed the hem back into Ellie's favorite dress 3 times before finally admitting the dress needed to be retired. She never once complained about the small bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that used to be Daniel's home office. There were small, painful details Daniel didn't notice at first, the kind that only mean something once you look back. Grace started eating dinner in her room some nights, instead of at the table. "I don't want to be in the way," she told Daniel once, when he asked why her plate wasn't at the table anymore. 3 years into living with them, the shop hit a rough patch. A client backed out of a $12,000 order after the materials had already been purchased. Daniel didn't tell his mother how bad it was. He didn't have to. She sold her wedding ring. Daniel didn't find out until 18 months later, when he saw the pawn shop receipt tucked into an old recipe box while looking for a lasagna recipe. He confronted her, hurt and furious that she hadn't told him, and Grace just shrugged and said, "Your father would have wanted the business to survive more than he'd have wanted a ring on a shelf." That was Grace. She gave things away quietly and let you find out later, if you found out at all. 3 weeks before the divorce hearing, Grace told Daniel she was going to visit her sister in Ohio for a short trip. Daniel kissed her goodbye at the door, told her to call when she landed, and didn't think anything else of it. She never came back. Daniel found out why almost by accident. He was helping Ellie with a school project one evening, sorting through old photos for a family tree assignment, when Ellie said, without looking up from her glue stick, "Grandma's not coming back, right? Mommy said the house is too full now." Daniel remembers that his hands went still over the photos. "What do you mean too full?" he asked. "Mommy said Grandma needed her own space. She said it's better for everybody." Daniel called Grace that night. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice smaller than he remembered it. "I'm fine, mijo," she said. "Don't worry about me." But she wouldn't tell him where she was staying, and when he asked to video call, she said the connection was bad and hung up. That was the first night Daniel lay awake with a feeling he couldn't yet name, the feeling of something being wrong in his own house that he hadn't been allowed to see. To understand Melissa, Daniel wrote, "You have to understand that she was never a villain in the beginning. She grew up watching her parents scrape by, and she'd built her whole adult identity around the idea that she would never live that way again. She was sharp, funny, image-conscious in a way that made her magnetic at parties and exhausting at home. She wanted nice things, and for the first several years of their marriage, Daniel didn't begrudge her that. He liked seeing her happy. He liked being the reason she smiled. The cracks were small at first, small enough that Daniel talked himself out of noticing them for a long time, except Daniel's cousin mentioned it once at a barbecue, half joking. "Staying with you? She's been there 4 years, Mel." And Melissa had laughed it off, but her jaw had tightened in a way Daniel had never seen before. She began taking business calls in another room. At first Daniel assumed it was just her being considerate of the noise, but it kept happening, even when the house was empty except for the 2 of them. Once, he walked in on the tail end of a call and heard her say, "No, he doesn't need to know about that part yet," before she noticed him in the doorway, had ever landed, vanished from the shop's shared inbox the week it was due. Melissa managed some of the shop's admin work by then, a role Daniel had happily handed her because she was better with computers than I am. When the invoice disappeared and the client, furious at the delay, walked, Melissa apologized and blamed a glitch in the new software. "These things happen," she told him, rubbing his shoulder. "Don't stress about it, baby, we'll get the next one." Nothing, alone was damning. A phrase here, a missed call there, that's what made it so easy for her, he realized later. Nobody suspects a pattern while they're still inside it. Melissa shifted in her seat. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something to her. She shook her head, once, sharply, and looked straight ahead at the judge. Ryan had stopped smiling entirely. The first real fight happened 2 weeks after Ellie mentioned Grandma wasn't coming back. Daniel waited until Ellie was asleep, then found Melissa in the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine with the particular calm of someone who already knew a conversation was coming, and had decided in advance how she'd win it. "You know that? Ellie said you told her the house is too full now." Melissa didn't even flinch. "Because it is too full. Your mother has been in that back room for 4 years, Daniel. 4 years. We said temporary. She's my mother, and I'm your wife," Melissa snapped, "and apparently that means less in this house than a woman who eats dinner alone in her bedroom, because she's too proud to admit she's a guest who overstayed." Daniel felt something crack in his chest, not fully broken yet, but fractured in a way that would never fully close again. "That's not fair. She's not a—" "You're too soft to see what's obvious," Melissa said, her voice suddenly quieter, colder, more controlled than the anger that had come before it. "You always have been. That's why I've had to start handling things myself." "Handling what things?" Melissa set her wine glass down harder than she meant to. You signed the restructuring papers 6 months ago, remember? The tax paperwork? Yeah, so I have equal legal say in what happens to this family's assets now. The shop, this house, all of it. So don't act like every decision about this family is only yours to make anymore. For the first time in the conversation, something flickered across her face. Not guilt, exactly, but the recognition of having said one sentence too many. She recovered fast. It said what my accountant told you it said, she replied. Standard restructuring. You should read things more carefully before you sign them, Daniel. That's on you, not me. She walked past him and up the stairs, leaving her wine glass half full on the counter. Daniel stood in the kitchen a long time that night, replaying her words. Equal legal say, all of it. He pulled the folder out of the filing cabinet the next morning before work. It was gone. 2 weeks later, a man named Ryan started showing up at the shop. Melissa introduced him the first time as a business consultant, helping us modernize things. He had an easy smile, expensive shoes for someone who claimed to specialize in small shop consulting, and a way of talking over Daniel's employees that made the whole floor go quiet whenever he walked in. You really should switch to a digital scheduling system, Ryan said during his second visit, loud enough for 2 of Daniel's longtime carpenters to hear. We've run this shop successfully for 10 years the way it is, Daniel said, keeping his voice level. Sure, Ryan said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. But there's successful, and then there's profit margin. Melissa and I have been talking about the difference. Melissa and I. Daniel noted the phrase and said nothing. Over the following weeks, Ryan's presence grew. He started sitting in on client calls to observe. He suggested changes to pricing that would have gutted Daniel's profit margin on custom work. The gut punch came on an ordinary Tuesday evening, when Ellie was flipping through an old photo album for the same school project, looking for pictures of when Daddy was young. She held up a faded photo from a family barbecue nearly 10 years earlier. Who's this guy, Daddy? She asked. He looks like Ryan. Daniel took the photo and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. It wasn't Ryan, but it was close enough that Daniel's stomach dropped before his mind caught up to why. He stared at the photo for a long time that night after Ellie went to bed. He found it in a folder marked, Disputes, Unpaid. 10 years earlier, a lumber supplier named Marcus Cole had taken a $40,000 order from Reyes & Co., collected payment up front for a bulk shipment, and vanished. The shipment never arrived. Daniel had spent months chasing him through emails that bounced and a phone number that was disconnected within a week. The business nearly folded that year. Daniel had never fully recovered the loss. He just absorbed it, the way he absorbed most things, and moved forward. 10 years older, a different haircut, a different name. Marcus Cole, Ryan Cole. His wife had brought the man who scammed him out of $40,000 directly into his own shop, calling him a consultant, letting him undermine Daniel in front of his own employees. Daniel didn't confront anyone that night. He sat at his workbench until 2 a.m., turning a chair leg over and over in his hands, saying nothing to no one. Ryan's leg had started bouncing under the table. Melissa glanced sideways at him, and for the first time, Daniel, watching from across the room, saw something that looked almost like fear pass between them. Daniel made a decision that night at the workbench. He wasn't going to confront anyone until he understood the full shape of what was happening. Emotional outbursts hadn't gotten him anywhere with Melissa before. Proof might. He started slowly. Old invoices from the Marcus Cole fraud, printed and filed. Screenshots of the supplier's archived website next to current photos of Ryan that Melissa had unknowingly left visible on her unlocked phone one morning. Bank statements he requested directly from their joint account manager. The polite kind of request that raises no alarms. The real break came on a Sunday afternoon when Melissa left for a weekend work retreat and forgot to log out of the family cloud account on the home computer. The same account they'd used for years to back up photos of Ellie's birthdays and school recitals. Daniel wasn't looking for anything. He'd opened the computer to print a shipping label. But a folder caught his eye, one he didn't recognize, labeled simply, Notes, Private. Inside were dozens of voice memos, dated back nearly a year. He almost didn't open the first one. Something in him already knew he wouldn't be able to unhear it. I need to make it look like he's unstable, erratic, like something's wrong with him, not with me. Another memo, dated 2 months later. Once the ownership transfer clears, we don't need him anymore. He'll never even see it coming. That's the thing about Daniel. He trusts everyone right up until it's too late to matter. Daniel sat in his own kitchen, in the house he'd worked 16-hour days to help pay for, and listened to his wife's voice calmly describing the destruction of his life like a project timeline. He thought about the restructuring papers he'd signed 6 months ago. He thought about his mother, somewhere in Ohio, or somewhere that wasn't Ohio at all, refusing to give him an address. He thought about Ryan's easy smile in his own shop, talking over his employees. For the first time since this all began, Daniel wasn't just hurt. He was afraid of exactly how far this had already gone without him. Daniel didn't confront Melissa that Sunday. He needed to understand the paperwork first. The restructuring documents he'd signed without reading. The ones that had somehow vanished from the filing cabinet. It took him 3 weeks, a forensic accountant referred by a client, and copies pulled directly from the county records office, but eventually the full picture came into view. The restructuring papers hadn't simply added Melissa as co-owner of Reyes & Co. Woodworks. They had transferred 70% ownership of the shop into a shell company, one Daniel had never heard of, registered under a name he didn't recognize because it used Ryan's actual legal name, Marcus Ryan Cole, not the alias Daniel knew him by. That was why the name on the paperwork hadn't triggered anything when Daniel skimmed it 6 months earlier. Daniel sat in the accountant's office and stared at the page until the numbers blurred. He hadn't just lost trust in his marriage, he had legally lost control of his own business, the one he'd built from a rented garage with library books and a torn shoulder he never treated, and he'd lost it months ago, without knowing, with his own signature at the bottom of the page. "Can this be reversed?" Daniel asked the accountant. "Possibly," the man said carefully. "If you can prove fraud in how the documents were presented to you, that's a legal question, not an accounting one." The ownership transfer described here, Melissa's lawyer stood quickly. "Your Honor, we'd ask that the court reserve judgment until." "I asked your client a question," the judge said. Melissa said nothing. The silence answered for her. Daniel hired a lawyer within the week, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Ovando, who had seen this pattern before and told him plainly, "This isn't a divorce case anymore, Mr. Reyes. This might be a fraud case, wearing a divorce case's clothes." Attaching bank statements that showed a series of large withdrawals over the past year. The framing was not. Melissa knew exactly what those withdrawals were. Daniel had been quietly paying for his mother's medical bills after a hip surgery Grace never told anyone the full cost of, timed to overlap suspiciously with a stretch when Daniel had also pulled cash for shop supplies. Out of context, stacked together on a page, it looked exactly like what Melissa wanted it to look like. A man spiraling, hiding money, possibly gambling it away. She used the report to push for sole custody of Ellie and requested a restraining order. Reading the filing felt like being accused of a crime he hadn't even understood existed. Worse was still coming. Daniel finally tracked down Grace's location through a cousin who'd overheard something at a family gathering. Not Ohio, not her sister's house at all, but a lighting assisted living facility 2 counties over. The kind with peeling paint in the hallways, and a waiting list because it was one of the cheapest in the state. He drove there the same afternoon he found out. His mother was sitting alone in a small shared room, thinner than he remembered, her eyes lighting up and then filling with tears the moment she saw him. "Mom, why didn't you tell me where you were? I've been calling for weeks." "They said you knew," Grace said, confused. "The woman who checked me in said you signed the papers. Family authorization, she called it. She said you agreed it was for the best." Daniel felt the floor tilt again, the same way it had the night Ellie showed him the photo of Ryan. "I never signed anything, Mom." The facility later confirmed it for him, reluctantly, after Patricia sent a formal records request, a family authorization form on file, with Daniel's signature at the bottom, a signature that, upon closer comparison, had clearly been traced from an old form Daniel had signed years earlier for Grace's original moving paperwork, the pen strokes identical down to the same slight hook on the R in Reyes. This was no longer just betrayal, this was fraud, forgery, and the quiet mistreatment of a 67-year-old widow who had given away her wedding ring to save a business that had just been legally stolen out from under her son. Patricia brought in a private investigator named Sam Okafor, a retired detective who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet, paper-based cruelty. Within 2 weeks, Okafor uncovered the piece that finally made the entire timeline collapse into place. The erratic behavior text Melissa had submitted as evidence, screenshots showing Daniel allegedly sending angry, threatening messages, had been sent from a second phone number. A number registered under a fake name, purchased with a prepaid card 11 months earlier. The SIM activated the same week as the first voice memo Daniel had found on the cloud account. Melissa hadn't reacted to a crumbling marriage by manufacturing evidence in a moment of panic. She had built the entire paper trail in advance. Months before Daniel had any idea anything was wrong, she was already constructing the story she would eventually tell a judge. The divorce wasn't the result of a marriage that broke. It was the plan. Daniel was simply the last person in the entire arrangement to find out about it. Okafor sat across from Daniel in Patricia's office, sliding a folder across the table. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Reyes. In 15 years doing this work, I don't see planning this deliberate very often. Why? He asked quietly. Would someone spend a year planning to destroy a life they used to say they loved? Okafor didn't have an answer yet, but he had one more lead to chase. The answer came a week later, and it wasn't the one Daniel expected. Okafor's background search on Ryan, real name Marcus Ryan Cole, turned up a marriage record from another state, filed 11 years earlier and never dissolved. A wife, 2 children ages 9 and 12 and address 3 states away, where according to neighbors Okafor spoke with by phone. He was using her exactly the way he'd used Daniel a decade earlier, getting close to something valuable, in this case a business worth taking apart, undervaluing, and reselling in pieces once the ownership transfer cleared, then vanishing before anyone connected the dots. Melissa wasn't only the villain in this story. She was also being used, and she didn't know it yet. Daniel wrote in his letter that this discovery didn't erase what she'd done, the forged signature, the fake evidence, his mother alone in a rundown facility, believing her own son had abandoned her. He had spent weeks picturing Melissa as the architect of his ruin. Now he understood she was also standing on ground that was about to collapse beneath her, and she still didn't see it coming, the same way he hadn't seen his own collapse coming 6 months earlier. She thought she was the one running the con, Patricia said, reading through Okafor's report. She's about to find out she was the mark the whole time. The judge paused on this page longer than any other. She looked up, first at Ryan, whose eyes were fixed on the exit doors at the back of the room, and then at Melissa, whose composure had fully cracked for the first time all hearing. Mr. Cole, the judge said, or should I say, Mr. Cole, using which name today? Ryan said nothing. The confrontation didn't happen in a kitchen or a courtroom hallway. It happened exactly where Daniel's letter says it needed to happen. Melissa's own sister, Bianca, had grown uneasy for months. Ever since Melissa had let something slip at a family dinner that Bianca couldn't stop thinking about afterward. When Patricia's office reached out during the investigation, Bianca hesitated, then handed over a recorded phone call from 8 months earlier, one she'd saved without fully understanding why at the time. In it, Melissa's voice, light and amused, talking to her sister like she was sharing good news. The room went completely silent except for the tinny sound of Melissa's own laughter coming through Patricia's phone speaker. Daniel didn't look at Melissa while it played. He looked at the table in front of him, at his own hands, rough from 30 years of work, and let the recording speak for him. When it ended, the judge set down her pen. Mrs. Reyes, she said, would you like to explain this to the court? Melissa opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Beside her, Ryan had gone very still, the kind of stillness that comes right before someone decides to run. A bailiff, who had quietly moved to stand near them 10 minutes earlier, after Patricia had passed a note to the judge's clerk about an outstanding warrant in another state, stepped slightly to block the path. Sit down, sir, the bailiff said. Ryan sat down. For the first time since the hearing began, Melissa turned and looked at Daniel, not with contempt, not with the cold control she'd used in the kitchen months earlier, but with something closer to panic, the look of someone realizing the ground. He wrote that in that moment, he didn't feel triumphant, he felt tired. And sad. And finally, the judge ordered the ownership documents examined immediately. Not weeks later in some scheduled hearing, but right there, with a forensic handwriting consultant who happened to be present that morning for an unrelated case, pulled in on the spot at Patricia's request. The consultant compared Daniel's authorization signature on Grace's care facility transfer form against 3 verified samples of his real signature. It took less than 15 minutes. This signature was traced, the consultant told the court, not signed. This was copied from an existing document, most likely by placing it beneath a light source and tracing the outline. The judge's expression hardened into something Daniel had not seen from her yet. This is no longer a divorce matter, she said. This is fraud. Possibly elder endangerment. I'm referring this to the district attorney's office. The final piece came during cross-examination, almost as an afterthought, when Patricia asked Melissa's sister one more question about the family's history with Daniel's shop property. Dad used to joke about it at dinner. Said whoever ended up with that land someday would be sitting on a small fortune. The room absorbed this slowly. It meant the relationship itself, the one Daniel had believed in for 11 years, the one he'd built a family and a business around, may never have begun as love at all. It may have begun as a calculation, made by people who saw a struggling carpenter with a plot of land worth more than he ever knew, years before he'd even met the woman who would become his wife. Ryan was arrested in the courthouse parking lot 20 minutes later, on an outstanding fraud warrant from another state that had been waiting for him for over a year. The restraining order request was dismissed and, given the fabricated evidence behind it, referred for its own review. The ownership transfer of Reyes & Co. Woodworks was ordered reversed pending a full fraud investigation, and Melissa was formally charged in connection with the forged care facility documents. She left the courthouse that day without her boyfriend, without her custody claim, without the business she'd spent a year quietly stealing, and without the version of herself she'd walked in believing she still was. Grace was sitting by the window of her small shared room, the same way she'd been sitting the first time he found her there. When she saw him in the doorway, she didn't ask about the hearing. She didn't ask about Melissa or the shop or any of it. She just held out her arms the way she had when Daniel was 6 years old and had skinned his knee in the driveway, and said, "There you are, mijo." He packed her few belongings into 2 small bags. It didn't take long. She hadn't accumulated much in her weeks there, hadn't wanted to, some quiet part of her still hoping she wouldn't be staying. Ellie was waiting on the porch steps when they pulled in, and she ran to her grandmother before the car had even fully stopped, wrapping her arms around Grace's waist and holding on the way children hold on when they don't yet have words for relief. That night, for the first time in months, all 3 of them sat at the same table for dinner. Grace made her own chair, the one she used to eat alone in her room, apologizing for being in the way, and set it at the head of the table instead, and nobody moved it back. The judge, weeks later, finished reading the letter into the court record for the official file. The last lines, the ones Daniel had written the night before the hearing, sitting alone at his workbench with sawdust still on his hands, read, "I'm not asking you to punish her, Your Honor. That's not really what any of this was ever about for me. I'm asking you to see her, to see what actually happened here, clearly, the way I couldn't for far too long. Because I loved someone who was never really there. And I think the loneliest thing in the world is finding that out only after you've already given someone everything you have." He got his daughter, safe, staying with the parent who had never once needed a forged signature to prove he loved her. He got his shop back, slowly, through the process the courts required, built again, this time with eyes open. And he got something he hadn't expected to find in any of it, the understanding that trust, once broken this completely, doesn't have to make a person bitter. It can make him careful. It can make him grateful for the people who never needed elaborate plans to prove they belonged in his life. The mother who gave away her wedding ring rather than burden him. The daughter who ran to her grandmother without being told to. Others, if you're patient enough to let the truth finally surface, can be rebuilt on what's left once the lies are gone. Daniel's, in the end, was the second kind.
Moral of the story: trust isn't weakness, but blind trust, given without ever checking in, leaves room for people to rewrite your life while you're too busy holding it together to notice. Daniel's downfall wasn't that he loved too much, it's that he never stopped to ask what his love was being used to build. The real lesson lives in the contrast between his mother and his wife. Grace gave everything: her ring, her comfort, her voice, and asked for nothing back. Melissa took everything and made it look like generosity. Love that keeps quietly, without needing credit, and in the end, truth doesn't need to be forced into the light. It surfaces on its own timeline, usually right when the people hiding it feel safest. Karma here isn't loud or theatrical. It's a forged signature caught by a pen's pressure, a voice memo left in an unlocked folder, a sister who couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Justice rarely arrives as thunder. It arrives as the quiet unraveling of a lie that was never built to last.